So I'm going to talk about, you had some questions about genetics, and I think that it's a very complicated area, very confusing. So I'm going to do my best to try to clarify some issues with that. And I think some of these slides will be a little detailed, so some of you will find it's still a little confusing. So, you know, just I tried to find some place that would make sense to people. And if you have questions, you know, please ask more questions. But anyway, I think this will, yep, here we go. So we're going to talk about cancer biology and hereditary issues. So just to start with, here's some helpful biology to know about when we're talking about all this genetic stuff. So this is a cell, a normal cell in your body. You've probably heard of, you know, DNA, so that's your chromosomes. Here you have 2 copies of the chromosome, and that is composed of DNA, which is your genetic information. And each of those little individual pieces of genetic information are called genes. So a bunch of genes make up these chromosomes. So what happens is certain genes will be expressed. Okay, when that happens, that means there's a message made of this kind of gene blueprint. And so that gene blueprint has the message made, and then that message is turned into a protein in the cell. And the protein is what actually does the functional stuff typically. So this is just kind of a basic representation of what typically happens. And you know, when we talk about DNA versus RNA versus protein, you might hear that at some point. So this is a cancer cell. So you could have a mutation, for example, in the DNA in a tumor suppressor gene. So a good example for that for uveal melanoma is BAP1. BAP1 is actually a tumor suppressor gene. So what happens if you have a mutation in the BAP1 gene here? Well, what happens is you don't make the RNA for the BAP1, okay, and then you don't make the protein for the BAP1. So BAP1 is a tumor suppressor. That means it's suppressing basically these cancer types of functions. So that means if you remove the suppressor, it's like you're taking the brake out of the car, okay? And that can lead to uncontrolled tumor growth. So that's one example of how, you know, DNA mutation can affect eye melanoma. You could also have a mutation in something called an oncogene. So that is a gene that if it's mutated, it can gain a function of making the cell grow too much. And it's kind of like having the gas pedal stuck on. So that's over here on the right. An example of an oncogene for uveal melanoma is GNA11 or GNAQ. You might have heard of some of those genes. And so what happens in those mutations, it's kind of like this pathway. You've seen a lot of these pictures of these pathways. That pathway is left on, and it just tells the cell, grow, 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 divide, spread. You know, so that's what's going on here if you have this type of mutation. You have too much message, too much protein, making the cells grow and survive when they shouldn't be. So those are 2 types of mutations that can happen in uveal melanoma. Now, this is probably the most confusing area that people have questions about. There's something called somatic gene mutations, and there's something called germline gene mutations. Somatic gene mutations is not something, it's only in the tumor itself, okay? So somatic means cell. It's just in basically one area, which is your eye tumor. So for example, you could have a somatic mutation where you have, you know, mutation of BAP1, for example, just in the eye tumor. But all your cells in the rest of your body have normal BAP1, okay? So that tumor suppressor is normal everywhere else. If that's the case, you're not going to pass that down to any children, okay? That's not heritable. That's only in the tumor. The way this is helpful, though, for us is this has prognostic information of your tumor behavior. And so that can tell us, is this likely to be a tumor that is going to be more aggressive, or is it likely a tumor that's going to be less aggressive? So that's where this is very helpful. And so you've heard of this kind of stuff when people talk about tumor testing and tumor genetics. You know, almost all the time, you know, they're talking about this type of somatic mutations, or for example, loss of chromosome 3, like Dr. D'Amato was talking about. You know, that's, you know, loss of the actual chromosome. So that's what we get from the tumor biopsy. We can look at the DNA or RNA level, you know, at these types of things. So there are different tests to look at this. So that's the genetic testing that we most commonly talk about. I'm not going to focus on that too much, except to just show you just a graphical representation. This is a picture, kind of like what we call a karyotype, where you have the different chromosomes. So for most genes, you have 2 copies of the chromosome, but for chromosome 3, in this tumor tissue, you only have 1 chromosome of 3. And so this is just a kind of a picture representation of what monosomy of chromosome 3 looks like. You only have 1 copy instead of the normal 2. And this is another test that we can do called FISH, where it uses a fluorescent label to show that you only have 1 copy of chromosome 3, for example, in this sample. And there are a lot of even more sophisticated ways to look at this kind of information. So in addition to that, you can also look at specific gene mutations. And these types of tests can be done on DNA, like we're talking about here, and they can also be done on RNA, the message. And so if you talk about gene expression profiling, like class 1, class 2, that's actually an RNA-based test. And so that can also be good at dividing into a lower risk and a higher risk group. So those are somatic gene changes. Now this is the other one called germline mutations. So basically for germline mutations, that means all cells in the body have this mutation. So for example, a BAP1 mutation could develop maybe in the egg or the sperm, and then that's transmitted to the child. So in this child, all cells have a BAP1 mutation, okay? So in people who would have a germline BAP1 mutation, they might be at risk for a higher risk for developing cancer, in the eye, but also maybe other places as well, because it's a tumor suppressor that's important in a lot of different cell types. So this is the situation where it's heritable, that could be passed on to children, and you can sometimes see a cancer, what we call cancer family syndrome, where a lot of people will have cancer in the family, or maybe one person will have had many cancers. So this is something that we're suspicious of a cancer, some sort of gene mutation that causes these cancer family syndromes. And this is something that we're studying. Often this is not a typical test that you're going to get. The germline mutation is less common than that somatic mutation that I showed you. And the way it's measured, we don't measure it by measuring the tumor DNA, really. We actually get that measured by looking at the peripheral blood, so a blood sample or maybe a cheek swab sample, because we want to look at your regular DNA and see if you have this type of mutation. So again, it's not a typical thing that we would get for everybody, but certainly in our research, we want to find people who have this higher risk of cancer based on their personal and family history, and then go ahead and test them. So why do we care about hereditary cancer and uveal melanoma? Because basically that's a pretty rare kind of thing. And so it just means you inherit a higher risk for developing cancer. Okay, so you don't necessarily, doesn't mean you're going to get cancer, but you just have a higher risk of developing that. And often that's called a tumor predisposition syndrome. So in the formal medical language, that's how that's referred to. And like I said, you can see multiple cancers if somebody has that syndrome, they have multiple cancers in the family or in the individual. Or sometimes you don't really have much of a family history, and it could be a new germline mutation, and then with time, maybe the kids will develop something like that, and you'll see a new family history developing. And then the type of cancer that develops really depends on what gene is mutated. So it's really important to, if you have looks like a cancer syndrome, to try to figure out what cancers are part of that syndrome so we can screen people and do something about that. So with our group, my colleague Mohammed Abdel Rahman is a clinical cancer geneticist, and he's been working to basically test patients for these hereditary cancer syndromes. And if just anybody who's ever had eye melanoma, around 10%, maybe around 11%, have evidence of a hereditary cancer predisposition. Okay, so that's a pretty high number, and that's something that we're trying to find out more about. And there are many, I'm not going to go into this too much, but there are basically there's a lot of evidence that shows, there could be a higher risk of breast cancer, could be other cancers. So it's not just eye melanoma cancer. And in fact, eye melanoma in multiple individuals in a family is extremely rare. So Dr. Singh has reported some research on this in the past, and about 0.6% of people with eye melanoma would have this, quote, familial eye melanoma, in which you can see multiple people with eye melanoma in the family. But again, the people who do have that situation, they're 4 times more likely to have even other cancers. So again, it's really important to learn more about that so we can screen people. These are just some of the genes that have been looked at, and you can see how rare they are to be a germline mutation for hereditary uveal melanoma. So one is BRCA2, you've heard of that with breast cancer, that could be a rare cause. There's this CDKN2A, that's another rare cause. So anyway, that's, people are looking at things. But now BAP1 appears to be a little bit more common, important cause of these germline mutations. So BAP1 was first reported by Bill Harbour when he looked at actually a bunch of uveal melanomas that were very aggressive and were metastatic. And those he found were, had mutations in BAP1 to a very high percentage. And one of the patients in that study actually appeared to have a germline mutation of BAP1. So what's interesting about BAP1 is that, first of all, we want to screen people who would be at risk for having this germline condition, and also it may offer some potential treatment opportunities. So these are some of the papers, including our group, that looked at BAP1 in terms of germline causes of mutation. So what are these cancers that are associated with germline BAP1 mutations? So one is uveal melanoma, another one is skin melanoma. Probably the other most common one is mesothelioma. So that's actually kind of, you might have heard of that with asbestos exposure. That's something that in these patients, many of them have not been exposed to asbestos. So it's just something that people can be predisposed to. Renal cell cancer, so kidney cancer. And then there are other cancers. These are some of the other cancers that we've seen and have been linked to BAP1 mutations. So, why do we care about this? Well, if we can identify the people who have these germline BAP1 mutations, one thing, we want them to all get a dilated eye exam early on. Look for nevi, which is the medical word for freckles. Nevi are precursors in most cases to eye melanoma. So if we can find those right away, we could even think about, should we treat those or, at least detect them as early as possible. We care about people getting screening, especially skin cancer. People are at risk for skin melanoma, so it's really important to identify people who are at risk for this. So basically, this is a busy slide, but our group is trying to, based on the literature, the earliest known cases in these syndromes, figure out how early should people get eye exams and skin exams. So one thought of our group was that 5 years younger than the earliest reported case of eye melanoma is when we should start screening with a dilated eye exam every year for these kids. So probably maybe starting at 11 years of age would be reasonable. Also, if anybody has a freckle in these situations, they really need to be managed by an ocular oncologist right away, not by an optometrist or not by somebody who doesn't have that experience. And then in terms of the derm exam, skin exam, probably starting at age 22, which is again 5 years younger than the earliest reported skin melanoma. So these are going to probably change over time as we learn more. So let's see. In addition, BAP1 probably, in terms of these kind of hereditary predisposition cases, BAP1 probably, accounts between 3 to 5%. So there are probably other genes that are important in that, and that's what our group is really, hunting for, these other genes that are important. That's, if you're interested in that, I have a study that we're doing at Ohio State. So I can give you my card later if you would be interested in talking to me about that. But basically, we just, take some blood or a cheek swab sample and isolate DNA and look for potential genes that might cause these types of things. So I'll mention that. I'm just going to talk about our uveal melanoma team at Ohio State. I think the Cleveland Clinic panel and everybody here did an excellent job just talking about how important it is to try to go to a center who specializes in uveal melanoma because really it's such a rare cancer. I think a lot of oncologists just don't know that much about it. So I agree with that. And I'd just like to thank our funding sources and take any questions that you might have.
So my question is, has there been any academic cases yet of ocular melanoma in child?
Yes. Actually, we're collaborating with Dr. Singh from Cleveland Clinic, and we have a manuscript that's in review right now about that in uveal melanoma in young patients under age 30. And so I think the youngest patient we had was it was less than 3 months old, but it's very unusual to have that. That's extremely unusual. So again, I think most people in our study were in their 20s for the young people cohort. Question.
The question was, were their parents, did they have ocular melanoma?
The question was, did the parents of the youngest child have ocular melanoma? And the answer is no, the parents did not have anything. So, likely what could happen is the mutation can actually be a new one in that child. That's probably the most likely thing. Yeah, because they also didn't have much history of cancer in that family. And again, the family is maybe younger, so maybe with time that might change, but good question.
A question that I have for the genetic testing is, I know with the CASTLE program, they'll end up covering for insurance, and the UPenn, you have to pay for it. And for some people, you find out about your diagnosis, and very quickly you have to come up with $1,000, so that might be an impediment for some folks.
Right.
And then now they're also offering the BAP1 testing for $1,200 at Penn.
Who's offering that?
UPenn Genetics Lab, who does the genetic testing for Shields. So I guess the question is, that is an impediment for some people because you have to make a decision so quickly. Do you folks have any suggestions on how people can either handle that or I guess I'm just trying to say, it seems like it's so important if you want to get that testing done.
Yeah.
And I had both types of testing done. And then Dr. Sato said, you need to have BRCA testing. So I am BRCA2 positive as well now. So I'm glad I got all these testings done because it helps me make decisions.
Yep.
But what do people do when you're kind of faced with that and you want to know, but that may be a cost issue? So
if I could try to rephrase your question, basically the question is if, these tests can be pretty expensive, and so if that's an impediment for actually getting the testing, especially the germline testing, what should a person do in that situation? So, I think for the germline testing, with our study, what we've been doing is we've been offering testing for BAP1 on a research basis, and then if it's positive, then we ask the patient that it's okay to inform them of any clinically relevant results. So if it's positive and they want to know that, then what we do is the next step is send them to the genetic counselor and get the germline testing. So I think that could be an approach that works, pretty well. And again, the BAP1 mutation is only maybe about 5% of all these cases of people who are at risk for it. So again, I think it's important to just find also what are the other genes that are important. Yeah.
My wife's first cousin had ocular melanoma as well as my wife. Is that a rare enough occurrence to indicate possible germline mutation, and does that warrant further investigation?
So the question is, so this gentleman's wife and cousin both had a history of ocular melanoma, and so would that be a situation where you should be tested for germline mutation of BAP1? And I would say yes, that would be a good idea. Yeah, I think that's, if it's even in cousins, it's rare enough that may not be by accident. So I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
My question has to do with hereditary, and have they researched if any autoimmune system diseases play into the melanoma? And if you have an autoimmune system disease, would it be better to suppress your immune system versus build it up? And I guess that goes along with how does the immune system function in that regard?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. Okay, so I guess your question is, is there any link between having an autoimmune disease and having eye melanoma? And I don't know of any link. I don't know of any link that exists between that. In terms of metastatic disease, I think your immune system is helpful in combating metastatic disease, but then again, autoimmune diseases have can do terrible things to your body as well. So I think that's something that you'd really have to work with your oncologist, because it's a really difficult question. I don't really have the best answer for that question. Yeah, that's tough.
I've often wondered, since younger and younger people seem to be diagnosed with ocular melanoma, for someone, well, female in this case, class 2, still childbearing, no evidence of disease, if she were to become pregnant and there was METs present during the pregnancy, I'm not going to get into the treatment options, but my question was, since ocular melanoma can be more of a systemic type of cancer, can that be passed on to the developing fetus?
So the question is, in somebody who would develop metastatic uveal melanoma while they're pregnant, could the metastases be passed on to the fetus? And I guess that is a possibility. I'm going to ask Dr. Shrestari if he could comment on that.
Yeah, there's a theoretical chance there. I think there's a couple of ifs and big, kind of assumptions there. But the answer is it's not a 0% chance that if that pregnancy were to happen, that's correct.
Question?
Yeah, I was curious if you remain anonymous once you go into the trial, because I said for a kid, both my parents had cancer, and somebody had said sometimes once you're diagnosed with it and it's hereditary, then you have to worry about life insurance after the fact, or even for my children, because I've spoken to Rob and he sent me the kit, and then after speaking to a few people, I kind of just put it aside for fear of retribution against, lack of being able to obtain life insurance after that. Do you know how that goes? Does the HIPAA laws still apply to that? Is it anonymous or?
Yeah, so the question is, if you are thinking about getting genetic testing for a germline, heritable thing, or any type of genetic testing, there was a recommendation to, if you're thinking about buying life insurance, that you potentially could be discriminated against in terms of buying life insurance. And so you may want to, think about buying life insurance, prior to any genetic testing that's done. Now, I think that's true. I think that's one area where there can still be discrimination, apparently, in terms of getting life insurance. In terms of getting medical health insurance, there's this Genetics Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA is what it's called, and basically that should prevent you from being discriminated against in terms of getting health insurance. Now, insurance companies could still discriminate against people based on their, family history or something that's not based on that genetic test. But luckily, there are some new, developments in healthcare that will prevent that and pre-existing conditions. So I think, we've made some positive things. So I think the main issue that you bring up is a good one. Just that, life insurance is still potentially an area. It's my understanding that where you could have discrimination. So, anybody else have any more information about that? Do you have some information?
Yeah, the important thing is I ended up doing genetic counseling for the BRCA status, and you have to really go to a genetic counselor because they'll explain all this.
Yeah, that's really key.
You have to really go to a genetic counselor, and they'll explain all this to you. And it was interesting because before I got my blood drawn from her, I said, oh, well, is my life insurance up? And my husband goes, you already have cancer. I'm like, oh, forgot about that part. So since I already had the eye cancer, it was like, didn't really matter at that point, I guess. But it's so important if you want to get, I guess, a germline or a BRCA type testing, if the doctor thinks that's appropriate, is the genetic counselor will give you more information on genetics than you've ever had in your life. And then after that, you don't have to get your blood drawn that day. You can wait 3 or 4 months and really mull over all the information the genetic counselor gave you, and then go back and get it. But they'll help you understand all that. And we said for our kids, since I'm BRCA2 positive, is when that time comes, if they should decide to do anything about that, we want to make sure that they have life insurance, or at least realize, do this before, if they decide to do it in their teens, or not teens, in their 20s, they might not think about life insurance, because who thinks about life insurance in your 20s? But we need to remind them that before you get this test, they'll see a genetic counselor, but make sure that's all in order. But the genetic counselors are pretty phenomenal in helping you
that's
out.
a really good point. And, that's something that, if we do have somebody who does have a positive test on our research study, then we really think it is important to involve the genetic counselors. And they really do a great job of explaining this because it's extremely complicated and there are a lot of issues. Yeah. Question?
If someone is germline or BAP1 positive and then their child is screened and has a nevus, why wouldn't the standard of care be to remove the nevus, to treat it aggressively instead of just watchful waiting?
So I think, the question is, if somebody has a germline BAP1 mutation and the child then has a nevus, why shouldn't the standard of care be to aggressively treat that nevus in some way? So first of all, I think it's important to check the child and see if they have that BAP1 mutation, because they may or may not have it. And number two, I think, the BAP1 mutation, germline was discovered relatively recently, so I don't think there's been enough time, to really develop that kind of standard yet. But I think we're probably going to move in that direction. I don't know, Dr. D'Amato, do you want to comment about that at all? If a patient has a germline BAP1 mutation, would you think about treating their nevus or just watching it more closely, or what are your thoughts on that?
A lot would depend on how much the treatment would affect the vision. So it depends where the nevus is. 10% of us have got a nevus at the back of our eye, but melanoma is extremely rare. So the transformation to malignancy is rare. But if you've got a BAP1 mutation and the malignant change were to occur, then the risk of metastatic spread would be much higher. So for instance, with conjunctival nevi, if they occur in the caruncle, they tend to spread very early. So only last week I had a child with a nevus in the caruncle, and her mother wanted it removed, and I removed it without any hesitation. So exactly the same philosophy. But if it had been somewhere where there was less risk of spread and more risk of affecting the vision, then I would have thought twice about it.
And this brings up just one more thought too, that because we have, because BAP1 mutation and that syndrome is pretty new, we really need to. Our thought is we probably need to develop a registry of BAP1 people with BAP1 mutation. And what a registry is it's a way for you, if you have a BAP1 mutation that's germline, you can report that I have this mutation, and then this is the type of cancer that I had, this is the age I had it. We really need to get that information. And so far, when there's a new gene, journals like to publish that information, but over time they're less enthusiastic about publishing that information. So over time it's harder to get that information from the literature. And that way, if we have a registry like they do for many other diseases, we can really still try to fully characterize, what is the BAP1 hereditary syndrome, what are those cancers that need to be screened for, what's going to be the best effective treatment, should we watch these nevi, what age should they get the dilated eye exam, those kinds of questions. So even that would be something that might look to groups like Ocular Melanoma Foundation, whether they might be able to help support, patient registry for something like that. But I think that would be really extremely important, and then we could really have a standard of care of how we manage that kind of problem.